A. Pay $65,000 or the wedding is off. That's what my daughter's fiancé said to me in front of 40 guests at her own engagement party. He said it with a grin on his face, like he was asking me to pass the gravy at Thanksgiving. He figured I was just a simple bank employee, some tired old man in a department store suit who spent his days stamping deposit slips. Everybody at that party laughed when he said it. A few of them even clapped. I smiled right back at him, excused myself for exactly 1 minute, and made a single phone call. By the time I walked back into that ballroom, nobody was laughing anymore. My name is Gerald Voss. I'm 61 years old, and for the last 24 years, I've worked at Heartland Union Bank here in Omaha, Nebraska. Most people who meet me assume I'm just another guy who works behind glass somewhere downtown. Maybe a teller who moved up a rung or two. Somebody who checks account balances and initials paperwork all day long. I never correct that assumption. I've never needed to. My daughter Claire is 27 years old. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me. Until that night at Elkhorn Ridge Country Club, I thought I knew everything I needed to know about the man she was planning to marry. Before I get into what happened, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments. I always like knowing who's listening. All right, let's get into it. This is the story of how one greedy demand at a party changed everything, and how a phone call most people at that table didn't even notice brought down a man who thought money and confidence could buy him anything he wanted. I want to walk you through this from the start, because the way it began tells you everything about how it ended. This was not some sudden explosion out of nowhere. This was months of small warning signs I chose to look past because I wanted my daughter to be happy, and because I trusted her judgment more than I trusted my own gut. That trust nearly cost us everything. It also gave me a front row seat to watch a con man's plan collapse in real time, in front of the very people he had spent a year trying to impress, in a room he assumed he controlled completely. Claire met Preston Adler at a charity auction about a year before any of this happened. He was 31, tall, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be next. And he talked about his investment consulting firm the way other men talk about a favorite ball club. Constantly, and always making it sound bigger than it probably was. He drove a black BMW that never seemed to have a speck of dust on it. He wore watches that cost more than my first house payment. And every time he sat at our dinner table, he found a way to mention some deal he had just closed, some client he had just landed, some number he wanted us to sit with for a moment. I have spent over 2 decades around real money. I know what it looks like, and I know what it looks like when somebody is dressing up like they have it. Preston talked about money constantly, but he never once picked up a check when the 4 of us went out together. There was always a reason. His card was acting strange. He would get us next time. He left his wallet at the office twice in 6 months, which struck me as an odd thing for a man running his own firm to keep forgetting. I noticed these things. I filed them away and said nothing, because Claire lit up every single time she talked about him. And I was not going to be the father who ruined his daughter's happiness over a handful of unpaid dinner tabs. My wife Diane noticed things too. She mentioned once that Preston asked a lot of questions about our house, about our savings, about whether banking had treated me well over the years. At the time we both waved it off as ordinary curiosity, the kind of thing a young man asks when he is trying to find his footing in a new family. Looking back, every one of those questions was a piece of a puzzle he was assembling, slowly, patiently. The exact way a conman always builds his case before he makes his real move. We simply did not know yet that we were the mark. The engagement party was held at Elkhorn Ridge Country Club, a venue Preston picked out and insisted on covering, though I later learned Diane and I had actually paid the deposit ourselves just to help things along, as Preston put it. There were about 40 guests that night, cow workers, family from both sides, a few of Claire's old roommates from college. Everyone dressed sharp, the champagne kept coming, and Claire looked happier than I had seen her in years. I remember standing near the bar with my brother-in-law, watching my daughter laugh with her girlfriends, thinking that this was exactly how a night like that should feel. Then Preston pulled me aside near the end of the toasts, in front of a small cluster of people who had drifted our way. He had that same easy grin on his face, the one he always wore right before asking for something. He said my name loud enough for the people nearby to hear, and told me he had been thinking hard about the wedding budget, and that honestly, $65,000 would really set them up right. A proper venue, a real honeymoon, maybe even a down payment on their first house afterward. I asked him what exactly he meant, keeping my voice level. That is when he said it plain as day, with a laugh in his voice, like it was some kind of joke between men. Pay the $65,000 or there would be no wedding. Simple as that. A few people around us actually laughed, thinking he was joking the way rich young men sometimes joke about money to sound bold. One of his friends clapped him on the back and called it a smooth move. I stood there for a second, looking at the man about to marry my daughter, demanding money from me in front of a room full of witnesses, treating the whole thing like a punchline. I smiled. I told him I needed a minute to think it over. Then I walked toward the hallway, pulled out my phone, and made a call that Preston Adler never saw coming. Here is the thing, Preston never bothered to find out, because he never asked the right questions. He simply assumed, I am not a teller. I am not a branch manager. I am the Senior Executive Vice President of Heartland Union Bank, one of the largest regional banks in the Midwest, and I sit on the Risk and Compliance Board with direct authority over account holds, fraud flags, and security freezes across every branch we operate in 3 states. I started at that bank 24 years ago as a loan officer making $29,500 a year, working my way up one promotion at a time, one late night at a time, raising Claire alone for the first 5 years of her life before I ever met Diane. I never talk about my job at parties. I never bring up my title or my salary or my position, because I learned a long time ago that people change how they treat you the moment they know what you are worth. I wanted Claire to bring home a man who loved her for herself, not for whatever her father supposedly controlled at the bank. So when Preston asked those questions about whether banking had treated me well, I gave him vague, dull answers about working in operations. I let him believe whatever he wanted to believe. Turns out he decided I was small, simple, and easy to push around. What Preston also did not know was that 6 weeks before that party, his name had already come up in an internal fraud review at the bank, flagged over unusual account activity tied to a business loan his consulting firm had taken out. I had not connected the dots to my own daughter's fiancé right away, because the paperwork used a slightly different spelling of his middle name. But standing in that hallway with my phone in my hand, all those pieces clicked together at once, and I understood exactly who I was dealing with. I stepped out of the ballroom, past the coat check, and dialed a number I know better than my own daughter's birthday, the direct line to our regional operations center. Owen Pratt picked up on the second ring. Owen had worked under me for 9 years, and he knew from the sound of my voice alone that this was not a social call. Owen. "I need you to pull an account for me right now," I told him. "Under the name Preston Adler, a business account tied to Adler Capital Partners." I gave him the details I remembered from the fraud review, and within about 60 seconds he had it up on his screen. "Gerald," he said, "this account already has a compliance flag on it from 5 weeks back. Unusual deposits, inconsistent business documentation, 2 other flagged transactions tied to personal accounts. We were set to escalate it next week. I told him to escalate it right now, tonight, under my direct authorization as reviewing executive. I asked him to place an immediate security hold on every account under that name and every account linked to it. Standard procedure for suspected fraud. Fully within my authority, fully within the bank's own policy. Owen didn't hesitate. "Done, Gerald," he said. "Hold's active as of right now. He won't move a dollar until this clears review." I stood in that hallway a moment after hanging up, feeling something settle in my chest I had not expected. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. This was not me being a vindictive father, trying to punish a young man for making a scene at a party. This was me doing my job, following the same procedure I would follow for any other flagged account, except this time the account happened to belong to the man trying to marry my daughter. I straightened my jacket, slipped my phone back in my pocket, and walked back into the ballroom with a calm smile, because I already knew what was coming. I found Preston near the bar, laughing with his friends, clearly proud of the little scene he had just made in front of everyone. I walked up, smiled, and told him I had thought over his offer and needed a few minutes to make arrangements. He grinned and told me to take my time. "No rush, just don't take too long." His friends chuckled again. I patted him on the shoulder and went to find Diane and Claire near the dessert table. For the next 15 minutes, I just watched. It happened right when Preston tried to buy a round of drinks for his friends at the bar. A small, generous gesture meant to look good in front of everyone. His card was declined. He laughed it off and tried a second card, also declined. The bartender, apologetic, told him both cards were showing a hold from the issuing bank. Preston's smile started to fade as he pulled out his phone and saw a text alert about unusual activity and a temporary security freeze. He stepped away, dialing someone quickly, his voice dropping low. Word travels fast at a party like that, especially when a man who just demanded $65,000 in front of everyone suddenly cannot pay for a round of cocktails. People started glancing over, whispering, putting the pieces together. The mood in that room shifted from celebration to confusion in about 10 minutes flat. Claire walked over to me quietly and asked if I knew what was going on with Preston's cards. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time all night, I did not have to pretend everything was fine. "I think you and I need to sit down somewhere quiet," I told her. "There's some things about Preston I need you to know." Preston came storming over to where Claire and I were standing, his face red, all his polish gone. "Gerald, what did you do?" he said, loud enough that a small circle of guests turned to watch. I kept my voice calm and even the same voice I use in board meetings when someone is trying to bully their way through a bad decision. "I didn't do anything except my job." "Preston," I told him. "Your account got flagged for suspicious activity, and it's under review. That's standard procedure." He laughed, but it wasn't the same easy laugh from before. This one had an edge to it, panic dressed up as confidence. "You think you can just freeze my money because you don't like me," he said, stepping closer. I didn't step back. "I didn't freeze anything because I don't like you," I said. "Your account was flagged 5 weeks ago for irregular deposits and mismatched business documentation. That review was already underway before tonight. His face changed the moment I said 5 weeks ago, "Hey," because that meant this wasn't something I had cooked up out of anger at the party. This had already been sitting in a file, waiting. Guests nearby had gone quiet. Phones lowered, drinks forgotten, everyone watching this unravel in real time. Claire stood next to me, arms crossed, looking at Preston like she was seeing him for the first time. "Preston, is that true?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. He tried to backpedal, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that his accountant handled all of that, that it was probably a clerical error on the bank's end. But the more he talked, the more his story kept shifting, and the more people around us traded looks. A con man's biggest weakness is that his story has to hold up perfectly, every single time, in front of everyone. Preston's story was falling apart in real time in front of 40 witnesses. 3 days after the party, I sat down with Owen and our internal fraud team to go through the full file on Preston Adler, and what we found was worse than I expected. This was not the first time Preston had asked a future father-in-law for a large sum right before a wedding. Through some careful digging, cross-referencing his firm's records against other flagged accounts, Owen found 2 other cases over the past 3 years where Preston had been engaged, both times to women from families with money. Both times the engagement ended right around when a large sum was requested and then denied. In one case, 3 years earlier, a family in Wichita had wired Preston almost $42,000 for a wedding venue deposit that never actually existed. That money went straight toward paying off his personal debts and funding the lifestyle he used to impress women like my daughter. That wedding never happened either. The woman broke off the engagement once she learned the truth. But by then, the money was long gone, and Preston had simply moved on to his next target. His consulting firm, as far as we could tell from the paperwork, brought in almost no real income. Nearly everything about his lifestyle, the car, the watches, the country club membership, was funded through loans, credit, and money pulled from people who trusted him. I brought this information to Claire myself, sitting at our kitchen table with the printed pages laid out in front of her, letting her read through it at her own pace instead of just telling her what to think. I watched my daughter's face move through anger, disbelief, and finally a quiet kind of heartbreak as she realized the man she had planned to spend her life with had run the same routine, with small variations, on at least 2 other families before ours. "He wasn't in love with me," she said quietly. "He was in love with what he thought you had. I didn't say anything. I just put my hand over hers and let her sit with it." Claire wanted to confront Preston herself, and I respected that enough to let her take the lead, though I sat with her at the meeting, at a quiet coffee shop away from both families, just in case things got difficult. Preston showed up, looking like he hadn't slept in days, his usual polish gone, replaced by the tired, defensive look of a man who knows he's been caught. Claire slid the printed pages across the table to him, the Wichita family, the pattern of engagements, the consulting firm with almost no real clients. Preston tried a few different angles. First, denial, claiming the documents were wrong. Then anger, accusing me of digging through his private records out of spite. Then, finally, when neither worked, something closer to the truth. He admitted his business had been struggling for over a year, that he had taken on debt he couldn't pay back, and yes, that he had asked a previous fiancé's family for money before things fell apart. He tried to frame it as desperation rather than malice, tried to make it sound like circumstance had backed him into a corner rather than a choice he had made on purpose. More than once, with more than one family, Claire listened to all of it without saying much, arms crossed, her face steady in a way that made me proud even in that painful moment. When he finished, she asked him one simple question. Did you ever actually love me? Or did you just love the idea of what my father's money could do for you? Preston didn't answer right away, and that silence told her everything she needed to know. She stood up, took her engagement ring off her finger, set it on the table in front of him, and walked out of that coffee shop without looking back. I followed, right behind her, feeling like the luckiest father alive to have raised a daughter with that much strength. The weeks after the broken engagement were hard on Claire in ways I hadn't fully expected. It wasn't just heartbreak over losing Preston. It was the deeper sting of realizing she had been a target, that someone had studied her, courted her, and planned around her family's money the whole time, wearing love like a costume. She stayed with Diane and me for a few weeks, and some nights I would hear her crying quietly in her old bedroom, and I would sit outside her door a moment before deciding whether to knock, the same way I used to when she was 16 and going through her first real breakup. What helped Claire most, oddly enough, was hearing about the other woman from Wichita. Through some careful, respectful outreach from our fraud team, we learned her name was Renee Castillo, and she had gone through almost the exact same thing 3 years earlier, minus the dramatic party scene. Claire reached out to her privately, and the two of them talked for hours on the phone, comparing notes, realizing just how calculated and rehearsed Preston's whole approach had been. There is a strange kind of comfort in knowing you weren't foolish, that you were up against someone who had practiced this exact routine before. Claire started to heal once she understood this wasn't a reflection of her judgment. It was a reflection of Preston's design. Meanwhile, our fraud and compliance team formally referred the full pattern of Preston's activity. The fabricated business records, the fraudulent loan applications, the pattern with Renee's family to the appropriate authorities, since this had moved well past an internal bank matter into actual criminal fraud territory. I made sure Claire knew this wasn't about revenge on my part. It was simply the natural result of a man who had built his entire life on lies, finally running out of new families to lie to. Slowly, month by month, I watched my daughter come back to herself, stronger, more careful, but still every bit as warm and open as she had always been. 7 months after that party, Preston Adler was formally charged with fraud related to falsified business loan documents, the same documents our internal review had originally flagged. Once the investigation opened up, it didn't stay contained to just our bank. Other financial institutions where he had taken out loans under his consulting firm started reporting similar red flags, inflated income statements, fake client contracts, a business that looked profitable on paper but brought in almost nothing in reality. Renee's family, once they learned about the ongoing investigation, came forward as well, providing records of the $42,000 they had lost 3 years earlier. Preston's country club membership was suspended within weeks once word got around, and in a town where reputation moves faster than fact, people who once admired his confidence and his flashy car started keeping their distance, unwilling to be associated with a man now facing multiple fraud charges. His BMW, we later learned, had been leased under a business account that was also part of the fraud investigation, and it was repossessed less than 2 months after the engagement ended. The image he had spent years carefully building, the successful young consultant with money and confidence, collapsed almost as fast as it had been built, because none of it had ever been real to begin with. I felt something complicated watching all this unfold. Not joy exactly, because there is nothing joyful about watching a person's life fall apart, even someone who tried to hurt my family. But there was a deep, settled relief in knowing Claire had gotten out before any real money changed hands, before a wedding happened, before years of her life got tied to a man who saw her as nothing more than a path to her father's paycheck. The system worked the way it was supposed to work, slowly, carefully, built on facts rather than anger. In the end, it was Preston's own greed and impatience that exposed him, not some elaborate scheme on my part. Just a simple phone call and a policy I would have followed for any flagged account. A year and 2 months after that engagement party, Claire met someone new. A guy named Nathan, a high school science teacher, who drove a used Honda Civic with 110,000 miles on it, and had absolutely no idea what I did for a living until Claire told him months into dating, almost as an afterthought. When she told me that story, laughing, I felt something in my chest settle completely, because that is exactly the kind of reaction I had always hoped for. Someone who loved her for entirely ordinary, unremarkable reasons that had nothing to do with money at all. Deanne and I had dinner with Claire and Nathan a few weeks later, and I watched him split the bill without being asked, laugh at Diane's terrible jokes, and ask Claire thoughtful questions about her actual day rather than steering every conversation back to himself. It was such a small, quiet contrast to how things used to feel, but it meant everything. Claire seemed lighter around him in a way she hadn't been in a long time, not performing happiness for an audience. Just genuinely comfortable. Genuinely herself. As for the bank, that flagged account review became something of a case study internally, a reminder to our compliance team of why we follow procedure carefully and consistently, regardless of who is involved or how uncomfortable it might feel in the moment. I never told anyone at work the personal side of that story, that the flagged account belonged to my own daughter's fiancé, because it never needed to be office gossip. It just needed to be handled correctly, and it was. Some nights, sitting on the porch with Diane, I think about how differently things could have gone if I had stayed quiet that night at the party, if embarrassment or politeness had kept me from making that one simple call. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this to take away, it is this. Pay attention to the small things, the unpaid dinner checks, the constant questions about money. The way someone talks about wealth like it is the main character in every conversation. Those small details are rarely accidents, and they almost always add up to something bigger. If you are willing to look at them honestly, instead of explaining them away because you want someone to be good. I ignored those signs for almost a year because I wanted Claire to be happy. And it turns out the most loving thing I could have done was pay closer attention, not less. I also learned something about myself that night, something I probably needed to relearn after 24 years of keeping my career quiet and my head down at family gatherings. There is nothing wrong with staying humble, with not bragging about your title or your paycheck at parties. But there is also nothing wrong with using exactly what you have earned to protect the people you love when it actually matters. I didn't freeze Preston's account out of spite or revenge. I did it because it was the right call, professionally and personally. Sometimes those two things line up perfectly when you have spent your whole life trying to do things the right way. Claire is happy now. Genuinely, quietly happy, in a way that has nothing to do with country clubs or expensive watches or men trying to impress a room full of strangers. Diane and I still talk about that party sometimes, usually with a laugh now, instead of the tension we felt at the time. remembering the exact look on Preston's face when that bartender told him his card had been declined twice in a row. If you ever find yourself in a room full of people laughing at you because someone underestimated who you really are, remember, you don't have to raise your voice or make a scene. Sometimes the quietest, calmest people in the room are the ones holding all the real power. And all it takes is one phone call to prove it. Thanks for listening to this one all the way through. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories like this